Maybe now she'll finally learn she doesn't belong here, my daughter-in-law said as my dinner plate slid from the edge of the table and landed on the polished restaurant floor with a sharp clatter that seemed to echo through every corner of the room. Conversation stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the soft piano music drifting from the speakers suddenly felt distant. I sat perfectly still, staring at the scattered pieces of rosemary chicken and mashed potatoes spread across the white tile. At 72 years old, I had lived through loss, disappointment, and heartbreak, but there was something uniquely painful about being humiliated by your own family in front of a room full of strangers. Vanessa crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair as though she had just won an argument no one else knew existed. My son Michael sat beside her, his face pale and uncomfortable, yet he said nothing. Not a single word. The silence hurt far more than the broken dinner plate. Across the table, my granddaughter Emily looked horrified. Her eyes moved from the mess on the floor to my face, silently searching for a reaction. I could have defended myself. I could have stood up and walked out. I could have reminded everyone at that table of 100 things they had conveniently forgotten. Instead, I picked up my linen napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my water glass. The restaurant remained quiet for another few seconds before the surrounding conversation slowly returned, though I could still feel curious eyes glancing in our direction. Vanessa gave a small laugh and shook her head. Honestly, she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, some people just make everything awkward. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth and said nothing. The truth was that this evening had begun very differently. Just 2 hours earlier, I had stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom adjusting a navy blue dress I only wore on special occasions. The dress had belonged to a happier chapter of my life, one filled with family dinners, holiday gatherings, and a husband who never allowed anyone to treat me with disrespect. My late husband, Richard, used to say that dignity was something no one could take unless you handed it over willingly. I remembered those words as I fastened a pair of pearl earrings and prepared for what I believed would be a joyful family celebration. Michael had recently received a major promotion at his company, and Vanessa insisted the entire family gather at one of Chicago's finest restaurants to celebrate. When the invitation arrived, I felt genuinely happy for my son. I even spent the afternoon choosing a thoughtful gift for him, a silver pen engraved with his initials. Something meaningful. Something a mother would give her child after years of cheering him on through every success and setback. As I drove through downtown Chicago that evening, the city lights reflected against the windows of the skyscrapers like scattered stars. I remember smiling to myself, thinking how proud Richard would have been. I had no idea that before the night ended, I would become the center of a humiliating scene in the middle of a crowded dining room. Nor did I realize that the same people who seemed eager to diminish me had absolutely no idea whose name was attached to the reservation, whose credit card was waiting with the manager, or who was quietly paying for every appetizer, every entree, every dessert, and every glass of wine being served that night. At that moment, though, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the broken plate on the floor, the uncomfortable silence around the table, and the sinking realization that Vanessa had finally stopped hiding how much she despised me. Emily was the first person to move. She pushed her chair back slightly and looked at me with the same worried expression she used to have when she was little and scraped her knee on the playground. She was 16 now, nearly grown, but in that moment I could still see the little girl who used to run into my kitchen every Saturday morning asking for pancakes shaped like hearts. "Grandma, are you okay?" she asked quietly. Before I could answer, Vanessa sighed dramatically and reached for her wine glass. "She is fine, Emily. Your grandmother always makes everything look worse than it is." I watched my granddaughter lower her eyes to the table. The disappointment on her face was impossible to miss. What hurt me most was not Vanessa's cruelty. By then, I had become familiar with it. What hurt was watching a young girl learn that disrespect could be ignored if the person being disrespected happened to be older and easier to dismiss. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Maybe we should just order another meal," he muttered. Vanessa laughed.
"Why?"
"She barely touches half her food anyway." The comment was followed by another uncomfortable silence. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and stared at the candle flickering in the center of the table. The golden light reflected against the crystal glasses and polished silverware. Around us, families celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and promotions. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying trays of beautifully plated meals. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked normal. Yet I felt strangely detached from it all, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. My mind drifted back through the years, searching for the moment things had changed. When Michael first introduced Vanessa nearly 18 years ago, I welcomed her with genuine warmth. She was ambitious, intelligent, and confident. I admired those qualities. I wanted my son to be happy. I remember inviting her to family barbecues, holiday dinners, and Sunday lunches. I treated her like family long before she officially became family. Back then, she smiled easily. She brought flowers when she visited. She asked for recipes and complimented my cooking. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether those smiles were ever sincere. The first crack appeared shortly after Emily was born. Small things at first. Family photographs where I somehow ended up standing on the edge. Holiday plans discussed without including me. Invitations arriving later and later until they felt more like obligations than gestures of affection. Whenever I mentioned it to Michael, he always had an explanation. Vanessa was stressed. Vanessa was busy. Vanessa did not mean anything by it. Years passed that way. 1,000 tiny cuts disguised as misunderstandings. I never complained because I loved my son. I never pushed because I wanted peace. The waiter approached cautiously and asked whether I would like another entree prepared. His voice was kind. I thanked him and said no. Vanessa rolled her eyes. See? Drama. Emily looked directly at her mother. I do not think Grandma is the one causing the problem. The table fell silent again. Vanessa stared at her daughter in disbelief. Michael suddenly became very interested in the menu. For a brief moment, I felt a small flicker of pride. Emily still understood the difference between kindness and cruelty. Vanessa forced a smile. Teenagers think they know everything. Emily said nothing more, but she reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. That simple gesture meant more than she could possibly know. As I looked at my granddaughter, I realized she was the only reason I had continued attending these family gatherings during the past few years. She still called every week. She still remembered birthdays. She still asked about my garden and my volunteer work. She still saw me as a person rather than an inconvenience. Across the room, a manager in a dark suit stepped through a side doorway and began speaking with one of the servers. His eyes briefly scanned the dining room before settling on our table. The moment he recognized me, his expression changed. He nodded politely and started walking in our direction. I noticed immediately. Vanessa did not. She was too busy talking about herself. Michael did not notice either. But as the manager came closer, carrying a warm smile and an air of familiarity, I quietly straightened in my chair. Something told me the evening was about to take a turn none of them expected. The manager approached our table with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He stopped beside me and offered a warm smile that immediately caught Vanessa's attention. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, extending his hand, it is wonderful to see you again. We have not had the pleasure of welcoming you back in several months. I returned the smile and shook his hand. Thank you, Daniel. It is nice to be here. For the first time all evening, Vanessa looked confused. Her eyes moved between the manager and me as though she were trying to solve a puzzle she had never expected to encounter. Daniel turned slightly toward the rest of the table. I hope everything has been satisfactory tonight. Before anyone else could answer, Vanessa spoke. Actually, there was a small accident. She gestured toward the remains of my dinner that had already been cleaned away. Nothing serious. Daniel's expression remained professional, but I noticed a subtle shift in his eyes. He looked at me for a brief moment, then back at the table. I am glad everything has been handled. Emily watched the exchange closely. Michael looked increasingly uncomfortable. Daniel continued speaking with the easy familiarity of an old acquaintance. The chef still remembers your charitable gala from 3 years ago. He often talks about it. That event helped raise an incredible amount for the children's literacy program. Vanessa blinked. Charitable gala? She asked. Daniel nodded politely.
Yes.
Mrs. Whitmore has supported several community programs through events hosted here. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier silence. This one carried uncertainty. Vanessa opened her mouth as though she intended to say something, then thought better of it. Daniel wished us an enjoyable evening and stepped away to assist another table. The moment he left, Vanessa forced a laugh. Well, that was unexpected. Her voice sounded lighter than before, but I could hear the tension beneath it. Michael glanced at me. You never mentioned any of that. I shrugged gently. You never ask. Emily smiled behind her water glass. For the first time that evening, I felt a small sense of peace. Not because anyone had defended me, but because the carefully constructed image Vanessa carried in her mind was beginning to crack. For years she had treated me like an aging relative who simply appeared at holidays and family dinners. She had never bothered to learn anything about the life I lived outside her limited view of it. The truth was that after Richard passed away 6 years earlier, I had chosen not to retreat from the world. Grief had nearly swallowed me whole during that first year. There were mornings when the house felt unbearably quiet. Afternoons when I would find one of his old sweaters hanging in the closet and stand there for several minutes, unable to move. But eventually, I made a decision. I could either spend the rest of my life mourning what I had lost or honor his memory by continuing to live fully. So, I volunteered. I joined local boards. I supported charities Richard had cared about. I met people from every corner of the city. I built a life that felt meaningful again. Michael knew pieces of that story. Vanessa never cared enough to ask. The waiter arrived with dessert menus. Emily immediately pointed at a chocolate torte she wanted to try. Michael laughed softly and agreed. For a brief moment, the atmosphere seemed almost normal again. Then Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. I still think people should act their age, she said casually. Some people spend too much time trying to stay relevant. The words were aimed at me. Everyone knew it. Emily lowered her menu. Michael sighed. I simply folded my hands together. Richard used to tell me that insecurity often disguises itself as confidence. Looking at Vanessa, I finally understood exactly what he meant. She was trying very hard to regain control of a conversation that had quietly slipped away from her. Across the dining room, I noticed Daniel speaking with another employee near the front desk. A few moments later, he disappeared into an office. When he emerged again, he was carrying a black leather folder. Even from across the room, I recognized it immediately. My gaze lingered on it for only a second before I looked away. The evening was moving toward a moment I had never planned, yet somehow could no longer avoid. And judging by the confidence still sitting on Vanessa's face, she had absolutely no idea what was coming next. As dessert orders were placed and fresh coffee arrived at the table, I found myself drifting back through memories I had spent years trying to excuse. It is remarkable how clearly the past comes into focus once you stop defending people who have hurt you. For a long time, I convinced myself that every uncomfortable moment had been a misunderstanding. Every slight had a reasonable explanation. Every exclusion was simply bad timing. Sitting there beneath the warm restaurant lights, I realized how much energy I had wasted protecting Vanessa from the truth of her own behavior. The first Thanksgiving after she married Michael came back to me vividly. I had spent 2 days preparing dinner. The turkey roasted for hours. The pies cooled on every available counter. When I called to ask when they would arrive, Vanessa answered and casually informed me they had decided to celebrate with friends instead. No warning.
No apology.
Just a last-minute change delivered as though my time had no value. Michael later claimed he thought she had already told me. I accepted the explanation because that was easier than confronting the disappointment. Then there was Emily's 8th birthday party. Vanessa insisted there was limited seating and suggested I might be more comfortable skipping the event altogether. I remember sitting alone in my kitchen that afternoon looking at the wrapped present I never got to give in person. Emily called me later that evening, confused about why I had not attended. She had been told I was unavailable. That was the day I first understood that some exclusions were not accidental. Yet even then, I remained silent. I told myself family harmony mattered more than wounded pride. Richard would have disagreed. My husband had always possessed a gift for seeing people clearly. One evening, years before his passing, he sat beside me on our back porch, watching the sunset spill gold across the lawn. Vanessa had just left after another tense family gathering. Richard took a sip of coffee and said quietly, "Eleanor, some people do not value kindness. They mistake it for permission." At the time, I thought he was being overly protective. Now those words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable accuracy. Across the table, Vanessa continued talking about Michael's promotion. She described future vacations, larger investments, and plans for a new home renovation. Every sentence seemed designed to remind everyone how successful she believed herself to be. Michael smiled politely, though I noticed he contributed very little to the conversation. He looked tired, more tired than I remembered. Emily occasionally responded, but her attention kept drifting toward me. She sensed the tension. Teenagers often notice more than adults realize. The desserts arrived. Emily's chocolate torte, Michael's cheesecake. Vanessa ordered a lemon tart. I declined dessert entirely. "Not hungry?" Vanessa asked. "I am fine," I replied. She gave a small shrug. "Suit yourself." Her voice carried the same dismissive tone I had heard for years. Yet something was different tonight. Perhaps it was Daniel's unexpected appearance. Perhaps it was the realization that her assumptions about me were incomplete. Whatever the reason, she seemed increasingly determined to reassert control of the evening. A few minutes later, Daniel returned. The black leather folder remained tucked beneath his arm. He stopped beside the table once again, his professional smile firmly in place. "I hope everyone enjoyed their meals," he said. Vanessa immediately answered for the group. "Everything was wonderful." Daniel nodded. "Excellent. Mrs. Whitmore, may I have a brief word with you regarding the arrangements?" The question caught everyone's attention. Vanessa frowned. Michael looked confused. Emily simply watched. I met Daniel's eyes and understood immediately. The moment I had quietly anticipated all evening was drawing closer. "Of course," I said calmly. Daniel placed the leather folder on the edge of the table and offered a respectful nod. Around us, the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm of conversation and celebration. But at our table, a new silence settled in. This one carried curiosity, uncertainty, and the first faint cracks in a story Vanessa thought she completely understood. I opened the leather folder and glanced at the documents inside. Nothing about them surprised me because I had reviewed every detail earlier that week. What surprised everyone else was the look of recognition that immediately crossed Daniel's face when he saw my signature. "Everything is prepared exactly as requested, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His tone was respectful, but natural, the way people speak when they have worked together for years. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Requested," she repeated. Daniel smiled politely.
Yes.
"Mrs. Whitmore personally arranged this evening several weeks ago." The words settled over the table like a quiet snowfall. Michael blinked. "Mom arranged tonight?" I looked at my son and nodded. I did. For a moment nobody spoke. Emily's face brightened with surprise. Vanessa looked genuinely confused. "I thought the company was covering this celebration," she said. Michael slowly turned toward her. "I thought so too." Daniel waited patiently beside the table. I could feel Vanessa trying to piece together information that no longer fit the story she had constructed in her mind. For years she had assumed I existed on the edges of everyone's lives. A retired widow with too much time and too little importance. The reality was far less convenient. After Richard passed away, I inherited not only his savings, but also his belief that money should be used with purpose. Together, we had spent decades investing carefully, supporting local businesses, and building financial security that would outlast both of us. We never flaunted it. We never discussed it at family dinners. We simply lived quietly. The result was that people often underestimated us. Vanessa, especially. Actually, Daniel continued, Mrs. Whitmore reserved this private dining space nearly a month ago. She requested the chef's tasting menu, selected the wine pairings, and arranged the celebration package for your promotion. Michael stared at me. You did all that? I smiled gently. I was proud of you. My son lowered his eyes. The expression on his face shifted from confusion to something more complicated. Guilt, perhaps. Across from him, Vanessa forced a tight smile. Well, that was very generous. It was the first kind thing she had said to me all evening, and even she seemed aware of how hollow it sounded. Emily reached over and squeezed my hand again. That is amazing, Grandma. I thanked her quietly. Daniel then placed a single sheet of paper beside the folder. There is also one final item for your approval. I reviewed the page. Everything matched the arrangements we had discussed. Around us, the restaurant continued humming with conversation, but our table felt strangely isolated from the rest of the room. Vanessa kept glancing between me and the documents. I could almost see the questions forming behind her eyes. How much had I paid? How often did I come here? Why did the manager know me so well? Questions she would never have needed to ask if she had spent even a fraction of her energy getting to know me instead of judging me. Daniel waited while I signed the approval line. Then he collected the papers and nodded respectfully. Thank you again for everything you do for the community, Mrs. Whitmore. We are honored to have you here. With that, he stepped away. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. Mom, I had no idea. I know, I replied. He looked down at the tablecloth. I should have called more often. Emily smiled sadly. Vanessa said nothing at all. For the first time since the evening began, she seemed unsure of herself. The confidence that had fueled her cruel remarks was fading, replaced by uncertainty. And deep inside, I sensed that the most important part of the evening had not happened yet. The truth was beginning to surface, but some lessons take longer to learn than others. The atmosphere at the table changed after that. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It shifted the way a tide changes direction, so gradually that only careful observers notice it at first. Vanessa still wore a smile, but it no longer carried the confidence it had earlier in the evening. She had spent years believing she understood exactly who I was. Discovering she had been wrong clearly unsettled her. Michael sat quietly, turning his coffee cup between his hands. Every so often he looked at me, as though seeing me through a different lens. It was an expression I had not seen since he was much younger. Back when he still asked for advice. Back when he still called simply to hear my voice. How long have you been involved with those community programs? He finally asked. A while, I replied. Several years. You never told me. I smiled gently. You were busy building your career.
I was happy watching.
From the sidelines. He lowered his gaze again. Across the table, Emily looked between us. Grandma never misses any of my school events, she said quietly, even when nobody else notices. Her words hung in the air. Vanessa immediately straightened in her chair. That is not fair. Emily looked surprised. I was not criticizing anyone. It sounded like criticism. Michael rubbed his forehead. Can we not do this tonight? The exhaustion in his voice was impossible to miss. For years I had blamed Vanessa for every crack in our family. Sitting there now, I realized Michael carried responsibility too. Silence may feel harmless, but over time it becomes its own kind of choice. Every moment he failed to speak up had allowed disrespect to grow a little stronger. The waiter arrived with fresh coffee and cleared several dessert plates. As he worked, another employee approached carrying a framed photograph. He stopped beside me and smiled. Mrs. Whitmore, Daniel asked me to return this to you. He thought you might enjoy seeing it again. I immediately recognized the picture. It had been taken during a fundraising event several years earlier. Richard stood beside me in a dark suit, smiling exactly the way I remembered. The sight of him still had the power to stop me in my tracks. For a moment, I simply stared. Emily leaned closer. Grandpa looks so handsome. I laughed softly. He would have loved hearing that. The employee smiled and returned the photograph to the front desk display area. Vanessa watched the entire exchange. Her confusion deepened. This restaurant was not treating me like an occasional customer. They were treating me like someone whose presence mattered, someone whose history was remembered. I could almost hear the assumptions collapsing inside her head. You and Dad came here often? Michael asked. Quite often, I replied. Especially after you moved out. He nodded slowly. I never knew. There are many things we stop noticing when we become busy, I said. My words were gentle, but they landed with more force than I intended. Michael looked away. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa suddenly laughed. It sounded forced. Well, regardless of who planned dinner, tonight was supposed to celebrate Michael. Let us not make everything about someone else. Emily immediately frowned. Michael looked uncomfortable. I simply took a sip of coffee. There it was again. The need to pull attention back toward herself whenever control seemed to slip away. Richard used to call it insecurity dressed as confidence. The description fit perfectly. Across the room, Daniel emerged once more from his office. This time, he carried a larger folder and walked directly toward our table. His expression remained professional, but there was purpose in his stride. When he arrived, he placed the folder beside me and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Mrs. Whitmore, before the evening concludes, there is one final matter regarding the account that requires your authorization. The moment those words left his mouth, every eye at the table turned toward me. And for the first time all night, Vanessa looked genuinely nervous. Daniel opened the folder and carefully placed several documents on the table. The movement was simple, but it immediately captured everyone's attention. I apologize for the interruption, he said. I simply wanted to confirm the final details before we close the account for the evening. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Account, she asked. Daniel nodded.
Yes.
Mrs. Whitmore requested that all charges related to tonight's event be consolidated into a single account. Michael looked confused. I thought the restaurant would just bring the check at the end. Daniel offered a polite smile.
Normally, yes.
However, this evening was arranged differently.
He turned toward me.
Mrs. Whitmore has been one of our most valued patrons for many years. Because of that, we handle certain arrangements directly. The table fell silent again. Vanessa forced a laugh. Well, that sounds very impressive. Yet there was a strain in her voice that had not been there earlier. Daniel continued speaking with calm professionalism. In addition to tonight's celebration, Mrs. Whitmore sponsors several annual events hosted here. We always appreciate the opportunity to work with her. Emily's eyes widened. Grandma, really?
I
nodded. A few projects here and there. Michael stared at me. Mom, why did you never tell us any of this? I smiled softly, because it was never about being noticed. The answer seemed to affect him more than I expected. He looked down at the table and remained quiet. For years I had waited for my son to ask questions about my life. Not because I wanted praise, but because I wanted connection. Somewhere along the way, those conversations had stopped happening. Vanessa suddenly leaned forward. I still think people are making a bigger deal out of this than necessary. Her words sounded sharp, defensive. It is one dinner. Daniel remained perfectly courteous. Of course, although it is a rather generous dinner. He glanced briefly at the paperwork. Including the private dining reservation, specialty menu, premium service package, and guest accommodations, the total event value is just over $12,000. Nobody spoke. Even Vanessa seemed stunned by the number. Emily looked from face to face. Michael slowly blinked. 12,000, he repeated. Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. Vanessa's expression changed instantly. The confidence she had worn all evening vanished beneath visible disbelief. She looked at me as though seeing a stranger, not because of the amount itself, but because it challenged every assumption she had made. In her mind, I was supposed to be dependent, quiet, irrelevant. Certainly not the person responsible for an evening of that scale. Daniel gathered the papers and returned them to the folder. Everything has already been arranged exactly as requested. We simply needed final authorization. Then, he placed a sleek silver pen beside me. Whenever you are ready, Mrs. Whitmore. I recognized the moment for what it was. Not a victory. Not revenge. Simply the truth arriving in a room that had operated on false assumptions for far too long. I picked up the pen and signed the authorization page. My hand remained steady. Across the table, Vanessa sat unusually still.
No sarcastic remarks.
No dismissive comments.
No condescending smile.
For the first time all evening, she had nothing to say. Daniel reviewed the signature, nodded with satisfaction, and extended his hand. Thank you again, Mrs. Whitmore. It has been our honor. After he walked away, the silence lingered. Michael finally looked directly at me. There was regret in his eyes now. Not dramatic regret. Not the kind people express in movies. Something quieter. More real. The realization that he had stopped paying attention to someone who had never stopped caring about him. And sitting beside him, Vanessa appeared to understand that the evening she thought she controlled was slipping further and further beyond her grasp. After Daniel stepped away, nobody seemed eager to restart the conversation. The restaurant remained lively around us, but our table felt suspended in a different kind of silence. It was not the uncomfortable silence from earlier in the evening. This one carried reflection, questions, realizations. Michael slowly leaned back in his chair and looked around the private dining room. I could almost see him connecting pieces that had never mattered enough for him to notice before. Mom, he said quietly, how long have you been doing all of this? I smiled faintly. Long enough to know that the people who truly matter never need to hear about it. He nodded, but there was sadness in his expression. Emily reached for her glass of water. Grandma always helps people, she said. My school principal talks about her all the time. Michael looked surprised. Your principal knows Mom? Emily laughed softly. Of course. Grandma helped fund the reading center last year. Another silence followed. Not because anyone had run out of words, but because every answer seemed to reveal another piece of a life they had never bothered to understand. Vanessa stared down at the tablecloth. Earlier, she had dominated every conversation. Now she barely spoke. For years, she had measured people using visible markers, job titles, expensive clothes, social status. The problem with that approach is that it completely misses character. Richard used to say that some of the strongest people in the world prefer not to advertise their strength. Looking back, I think he understood human nature far better than I ever did. A server arrived carrying several small gift boxes tied with silver ribbons. He placed one in front of Michael and another in front of Emily. Compliments of Mrs. Whitmore, he said before leaving. Michael looked confused. What is this? Open it, I replied. Emily carefully untied her ribbon first. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with a simple message, never doubt your kindness. Her eyes immediately filled with emotion. Grandma, she whispered. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The world needs more people like you. Michael opened his box more slowly. Inside was the engraved pen I had selected for him weeks earlier. He turned it over in his hand and read the inscription. The smile that appeared on his face was genuine. Perhaps the first genuine smile I had seen from him all evening. You bought this for me? He asked. I was proud of your promotion, I said. I wanted you to have something meaningful. Michael looked down at the pen for several seconds. Then he set it carefully beside his plate. I do not deserve you sometimes. The words were quiet, honest. They touched me more than any apology could have. Across from him, Vanessa finally spoke. Nobody said you did not appreciate your mother. Her voice sounded defensive, tired. Michael turned toward her. Maybe not with words. The statement hung in the air. Emily looked away. I remained silent. This was not a conversation I needed to control. Some truths arrive on their own schedule. Vanessa folded her arms. You are acting like I am some terrible person. Michael sighed. That is not what I said. But even he did not sound convinced. For the first time that evening, Vanessa seemed to understand something important. The issue was never money. It was never the restaurant. It was never the cost of the dinner. The problem was the way she had treated someone she assumed held no value. And now that assumption had collapsed completely. At that moment, Daniel returned one final time. He carried a receipt folder and placed it gently beside me. Everything has been finalized, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Thank you again for your generosity. I signed the final page and closed the folder. The account was settled.
The
Evening was complete. Yet as I looked around the table, I realized the most significant transaction that night had nothing to do with money. Something far more valuable had changed hands. The illusion Vanessa had lived with for years was gone. And once a person sees the truth, there's no way to return to comfortable ignorance. When the final receipt disappeared into Daniel's folder, the evening seemed to exhale. The tension that had wrapped itself around our table for hours began to loosen, leaving behind something quieter, something more honest. I stood slowly and reached for my purse. Around us, the restaurant continued with its usual rhythm. Glasses clinked. Soft laughter drifted through the room. Conversations carried on as though nothing remarkable had happened. Yet for the 4 people sitting at our table, everything felt different. Emily rose first and wrapped her arms around me. "Thank you for tonight, Grandma," she said softly. I kissed the top of her head and smiled. "You never need to thank me for spending time together." She held the silver bracelet in her hand and looked as though she might cry. "I love you." "I love you too," I replied. Across the table, Michael remained seated for a moment before finally standing. The engraved pen rested safely inside its box. He picked it up carefully. "Mom," he began, then stopped. For several seconds he searched for words that did not come easily. "I think I forgot who you are." The honesty of the statement surprised me, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I reached over and touched his arm. "Life gets busy." He shook his head. "That is not an excuse." His eyes reflected years of missed phone calls, canceled visits, and conversations postponed until later. Later has a way of becoming never, if you are not careful. "I should have paid more attention," he said quietly. "I should have been there." I smiled gently. "You are here now." He nodded, though the regret remained visible. Some lessons arrive too late to undo the past, but not too late to change the future. Vanessa stood a few feet away, unusually silent. For most of the evening, she had dominated every conversation. Now she seemed uncertain where to place herself. The confidence that once came so naturally had been replaced by self-awareness. It was not humiliation I saw in her face. It was discomfort. The discomfort that comes when a person realizes they have badly misjudged someone. For a moment I considered saying something sharp, something memorable, something that would balance the scales. Instead, I thought of Richard. I thought of the countless times he reminded me that dignity is not proven through retaliation. It is proven through restraint. Vanessa finally met my eyes. "I may have made some assumptions," she said quietly. It was not quite an apology, but it was closer than anything I had heard from her in years. "We all make assumptions sometimes," I replied. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. I did not need more than that. The evening had already delivered every lesson it needed to deliver. As we walked toward the exit, several employees smiled and wished me a pleasant evening. Daniel held the door open. "We look forward to seeing you again soon, Mrs. Whitmore." "Thank you, Daniel." Outside, the Chicago air felt cool and refreshing. The city lights reflected across the sidewalks like scattered diamonds. Emily hugged me one more time before joining her parents. Michael lingered beside me. "Can I call you tomorrow?" he asked. The question sounded simple, yet it meant more than any expensive gift ever could. "I would like that," I said. He smiled. A real smile. The kind I had not seen in years. Then he walked toward his family. I watched them leave together before turning toward my own car. For the first time that night, I allowed myself a long, peaceful breath. The evening had not ended with an argument. It had not ended with revenge. It had ended with clarity. Sometimes people think respect comes from wealth, influence, or status. They are wrong. Respect comes from character. Wealth may reveal the truth, but character determines what that truth means. As I drove home through the glowing city streets, I found myself thinking about Richard again. He would have smiled at the entire situation, not because anyone had been proven wrong, but because the truth had finally been allowed to speak for itself. And sometimes that is the most powerful thing a person can do.